All right, Steve, let's dig into your son's swing here. First of all, I would say from a body movement standpoint, he moves really, really well. I love the rotation of his body. When I'm looking at it, look at the downswing, or excuse me, look at the backswing here from down the line view. He's got good tilts to his body. I like how the trail leg is lengthening out here. He's turning the hips on a nice inclination here. Shoulder plane is super strong here. Body movement is really good in the downswing. Strong pivot, good rotation, maintains his body angles and posture, maintains his tilts and his inclination to the ground really well. So a lot to work with here. Gets nice and open at impact. You can tell he's a good strong athlete. Lot to work with here. Where I see the problem is in the structure of his wrist, and so I will start by just defining a couple of terms. I know at times it can be a little bit overwhelming. People are like, okay, what do you mean by flexion? What do you mean by extension? So if you look at this little map I've thrown up here on the ground, so let's first talk flexion. And so that would be kind of bowing or arching your wrist. Think of positions at the top like a John Rahm or a Dustin Johnson, similar to that. And then over here on the right, you will see we have extension. And so that is essentially cupping your wrist. And we see that amongst a lot of higher handicap players. Now, the thing about it is there's also two other movements. There's radial deviation, which is down here on the bottom left. And radial deviation is basically cocking your wrist, or think of that in terms of lag in the downswing or in transition, so having a lot of wrist cock. And then lastly, you have the ulnar deviation, which would be arching your wrist downward. And so the interesting thing about these four movements is that they're coupled together. Okay, so the wrist is designed to move in two of these ways together. So flexion is coupled with ulnar deviation, and extension is coupled with radial deviation. So golfers who tend to cup their wrist a lot in extension tend to also radial deviate or cock their wrist a lot, or have a lot of lag, and that is the issue that your son is having. And this is a very important topic, because how the wrists move, and I'm particularly talking about the lead wrist here, so we'll just say his right wrist. How the wrists move basically control the club face alignment and the steepness or shallowness of the club in the downswing. And so first of all, I would start out by saying your son's grip is way too strong. The stronger you put your hands on the club, the more extension you're going to have in your lead wrist. And I would say he does not have a very orthodox grip at all. This is incredibly strong, and this would be the first thing that I would change in his pattern or swing if he were on the lesson tee with me. Now, are there great players who play with a grip that looks like this? Of course, but we're talking about day in and day out. More golfers come to me with this grip who have very poor club face control. And so the interesting thing about it, again, is the more extension, the more radial deviation there will be. So if we look at his shaft alignment at address, we could see that it pretty much goes in, straight up through just underneath his belt buckle. And I'd like to see the handle of the club a bit more higher than that. So I like to see the butt of the club pointing just above the belt buckle, maybe a little bit at the navel or belly button. So taking away some of that extension in the wrist and will add a little bit of ulnar deviation and help raise that handle. Now, the problem is in his swing is once he starts the backswing here and he's got all that extension in the wrist, if you look at how much this wrist is cupped here, and you can see an angle of his hand right there. The problem is he's got the club face in a good position, but he's doing it with a lot of extension in his wrist, and the problem is that is generally going to change at some point in the swing. And you can see it creates a bit of a longer swing. If he starts to shallow out that club with that wrist and extension, the face is going to get very, very open, which is what we see right here. You can see how the face is essentially hiding behind the shaft, so to speak. And just for comparison, I'll throw a player up there. Flip him around. And we'll just kind of look at the wrist alignments in similar positions. So right there, can't see the angle in the wrist that we were looking at with your sons here. Very, very different lead wrist conditions. Very flat over here on the right, very cupped over here on the left. And as we work through to the top of the, later in the backswing, you can see a very, very pronounced difference in those lead wrist conditions. And so when we come out of transition and we look at the club face, we'll see a lot different picture of how much club face we can actually see of each of these golfers. So you can see that on the right, he's presenting the club face to the camera much, much more there. And this is the most important frame in the entire golf swing, because every golfer is going to respond to two things in the downswing. They're going to respond to the pitch of the shaft. And so when I say that, I'm talking about how steep or how shallow the shaft is at this point. So they're going to respond to that, and they're going to respond to this club face alignment. So a golfer that has a very flat shaft with an open club face is going to rotate really hard around the corner in the downswing in an effort to square that face. And a golfer that has a steep shaft and an open face is going to stall out their body, generally pull down on that grip and stall and flip at the bottom to square that face. So in your son's case, face is pretty open. So as he's coming down, and you can see like right here, he's maxing out extension and radial deviation in that wrist. I mean, this is brutal to try to play golf with and try to match up the face at the bottom of the arc. Should look more like we see over here on the right. I can see a lot more of the back of that right hand. I can see the logo on that glove. Club face under control. And as he's approaching impact, he's going to try his best to start rotating that grip so that he can get that club face orientated. If you look at it right now, it's probably about like right here. So he's really already thrown that left hand and rotated that face in this direction to try to square the face, whereas the golfer on the right can just passively turn because the face is under control and you don't see it flipped over as much. And then when it comes out on the exit, it looks like that versus flipped straight down to the ground. So when golfers see this, when they see like, oh man, I'm flipping the club, like what's going on here, they're not really understanding cause and effect. And so it isn't because your son can't pivot. He has a really nice pivot. He moves his body really well. It's that he's got so much extension and lag in his wrist, his right wrist, and the face is twisting open, that he's got to coordinate kind of a time, stall, flip, move through the golf ball. So I would start with the grip. Definitely get the grip in a lot more orthodox position. Let's throw a face on up there. Try to zoom this thing in. So let's get the grip in a lot less strong of a grip. So we can see those two things there. I mean, they're just not even close. So he's got this angle down the forearm, got the grip going this way. I mean, you can see how much bend there is in the trail wrist here. So I'd start there. I weaken the grip, and then in transition, I get him to feel some flexion. So some examples of that, of what that looks like, would be like a Jordan Spieth at the top. You can see that nice little bowed left wrist. An example of that would be, another example would be, well, this guy over here on the right. No need to look any further, but in your son's case, that's where we start. We start with the grip, and then out of transition, we get him to feel like he's arching that wrist just a little bit, and that he's actually widening. This is going to sound crazy to you. He's actually widening the angle between the lead arm and the shaft. So if we measured this angle right now, this is still in the backswing here. We say, okay, here's the lead arm, here's the shaft, right? There's going to be a tiny bit of narrowing of that angle in transition because of the force that we're putting on the grip. But it shouldn't be dramatically narrowed like we see here with your son. Especially this late in the downswing. We should actually feel that angle getting wider. I think I've got them in about the same position right there. So your son should, if he can get this wrist angle flat at this point right here, the shaft should feel like it's widening out. It's moving further away from his trail shoulder. Because the problem with being as narrow as he is, to reach the ball, he's eventually going to have to start tilting back. And that's what we see right here. The problem is, as he's tilting that spine back, that face is also laying back more open, which is going to cause him to have to roll his hands over even more. So he's got a lot of what we call trigger delay with this lag in his lead wrist, and he's not allowing the club to line up. I mean, I'd say they're in about the same position right there. I mean, just because it lines up early doesn't mean we're not going to have shaft lean at impact and be hitting powerful shots. You most definitely can do that. But that look right there is the killer. So hope this helps you. If you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out.